Imagine a war so brief, it ended before most people even finished their breakfast. A war that shook a nation, decided the fate of a sultan, and lasted only 38 minutes. Yes, 38 minutes. The shortest war in all of human history. This is the story of the Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896, a conflict that began with ambition, pride, and defiance, and ended in less than the time it takes to watch an episode of your favorite show. But how could a war begin and end so quickly? What events led to this astonishing moment? And what lessons can we uncover from the shortest war ever recorded? Stay with us as we dive deep into the forgotten morning when the world's fastest war changed history forever. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because history is never boring when you know where to look. The year was 1896. The Indian Ocean shimmered with the golden hues of the morning sun, and the island of Zanzibar, lying just off the eastern coast of Africa, bustled with life. Spice merchants arranged cinnamon and cloves in neat rows along the narrow streets. Sailors sang in rhythmic tones while unloading cargo from dhows, their triangular sails catching the soft wind. The city of Stone Town, with its whitewashed coral houses and intricate carved doors, looked timeless, as though it had stood outside the rush of history. Yet within these peaceful walls, an event was about to unfold that would be remembered as the shortest war ever fought in human history. This story begins with a throne, a palace, and two leaders whose ambitions collided in less than an hour. The throne belonged to Zanzibar, a small but wealthy sultanate whose power stretched across trade routes in the Indian Ocean. Its palace stood proudly on the seafront, its towers overlooking the harbor where ships from Arabia, India, and Europe anchored daily. And the leaders. On one side was Khalid bin Barghash, a prince who dreamed of becoming sultan. On the other side stood the British authorities, determined to maintain their influence in the region. Their conflict would explode into a war lasting no longer than 38 minutes. But before cannons roared and treaties were rewritten, life in Zanzibar flowed with its usual rhythm. Children ran barefoot along the alleyways, their laughter echoing against stone walls. Traders haggled in Swahili, Arabic, and English, their voices mixing into a lively chorus. Fishermen pulled their nets from the turquoise sea, while women in brightly patterned kangas balanced baskets of fruit on their heads. To the ordinary people of Zanzibar, politics seemed far removed from daily struggles. Yet history often arrives uninvited, sweeping everyone into its current. The palace itself was a symbol of both beauty and tension. Built of coral stone and decorated with carved balconies, it faced the sea as though challenging the horizon. Within its rooms, conversations about power and succession grew sharper each day. Sultan Khalid bin Barghash, who had ruled Zanzibar under the watchful eye of the British, passed away unexpectedly on a warm August morning. His sudden death left a void, and into that void stepped Khalid bin Barghash, a man of strong will and ambition. Without waiting for approval from the British consul, Khalid declared himself the new sultan. For the British, who held enormous influence over the island's politics, this move was unacceptable. They had supported another candidate, a quieter man more willing to follow their advice. Khalid's boldness was seen as defiance, and in the world of empires, defiance was rarely tolerated. Within hours, telegrams were sent, warships adjusted their anchors in the harbor, and tension thickened like storm clouds before rain. At the center of this growing conflict stood ordinary Zanzibaris who watched events unfold with a mixture of curiosity and fear. Shopkeepers whispered to one another about the British ships lining the harbor. Children pointed at the flags flying above the palace. Musicians in the market changed their songs, replacing joyful rhythms with slower, more uncertain melodies. Rumors spread quickly. Some said the British would leave, others insisted they would stay and fight. And so, the stage was set. Two sides stood facing each other, each convinced of their own strength. Khalid, backed by loyal soldiers and defenders of the palace, believed he could hold his throne. The British, with warships positioned only a few hundred yards away, believed they could end the dispute swiftly. The world, however, would remember not the power of either side, but the brevity of what followed. Yet, in this introduction, it is important to pause before the cannons speak. For behind every headline about war are human stories. The young soldier polishing his rifle while thinking of his family, the palace servant sweeping corridors as tension grew heavier, the merchant who feared his spices would rot if trade stopped, and the children who asked why soldiers stood guard at the gates. These voices, often unheard, remind us that history is not only about rulers and empires, but also about the everyday people who lived through extraordinary times. The island of Zanzibar had always been a place where cultures met and sometimes collided. Arabs, Africans, Indians, and Europeans all left their marks on its streets. Its wealth came from cloves, ivory, and slaves, though by the late 19th century, international pressure had forced the Sultanate to reduce its involvement in the slave trade. Still, whispers of that painful past lingered in the city's markets. For the British, controlling Zanzibar was not only about trade, but also about securing power along the East African coast. For Khalid, seizing the throne was about independence, dignity, and the right of his people to choose their own leader. As the sun set on that fateful August day, lanterns flickered along the waterfront. The palace was lit from within, and guards stood ready at the gates. Across the harbor, the silhouettes of British warships loomed like watchful giants. The sea, usually a friend to Zanzibar, seemed to hold its breath. Nobody knew what the morning would bring, only that the air carried a weight too heavy for words. The war that would follow would not stretch for months or years. It would not echo with countless battles across continents. Instead, it would arrive like a sudden storm, fierce but brief, lasting less than the time it takes to share a meal or walk from one end of Stone Town to the other. And yet, its memory would endure, written into history books and whispered in classrooms, the war that lasted 38 minutes. In telling this story, we begin not with gunfire, but with a place, a people, and a choice. A palace by the sea, a throne left empty, a prince who would not wait for permission, and an empire that would not bend. The stage is ready. The players are in place. The curtain of history is about to rise. To understand why the shortest war in history unfolded on the island of Zanzibar, we must first step back in time. Wars are never born in a single day. They are shaped by years, even decades, of tension, ambition, and changing alliances. The Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896 was no different. Its roots lay deep in the island's history, woven into its trade networks, colonial politics, and the ambitions of foreign empires. Zanzibar, often called the Spice Island, had long been a jewel of the Indian Ocean. Its soil, rich and fertile, gave birth to cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, and other spices that carried exotic scents across oceans. For centuries, traders from Arabia, Persia, and India anchored their ships here, turning Stone Town into a cosmopolitan port. Languages mixed in its markets, and cultures blended in its streets. But this prosperity also attracted powerful eyes from far beyond the island's shores. During the early 19th century, Zanzibar came under the rule of the Omani sultans. Sultan Said, who reigned from the early 1800s, recognized the island's immense potential. He shifted his capital from Muscat in Oman to Zanzibar, making it the center of his empire. Under his leadership, Zanzibar flourished. Palaces rose along the coast, trade expanded, and the island became a hub not only for spices but also for ivory and, tragically, for the slave trade. By the mid-19th century, Zanzibar had become the largest slave market on the east coast of Africa. Enslaved men, women, and children were transported across the ocean, their lives torn apart to fuel wealth. Though this trade brought riches to the ruling elite, it also drew the attention of European powers. Britain, which had begun to campaign against slavery worldwide, saw Zanzibar both as a place to enforce its moral mission and as a valuable station along its imperial routes to India. Britain was not alone. Germany, Portugal, and France also had interests in East Africa. The late 19th century was the age of imperial expansion, often called the Scramble for Africa, when European nations carved territories across the continent. Zanzibar, strategically located along shipping routes, became a prize too tempting to ignore. The island's rulers, once independent, soon found themselves caught in the rivalries of empires. In 1890, a treaty was signed between Britain and Germany that secretly divided spheres of influence in East Africa. While Germany focused on the mainland, what would later become German East Africa, today known as Tanzania, Britain claimed its dominance over Zanzibar. This agreement effectively placed the island under British control, though officially it remained a sultanate. The sultans could still rule, but only under the watchful eyes of British advisors. This arrangement created a delicate balance. The sultans wanted to preserve their authority and dignity, while the British sought to ensure that Zanzibar followed their policies. At times, cooperation was smooth, but at other times, disagreements simmered beneath the surface. The question of succession, the matter of who would become the next sultan, was especially sensitive. Britain wanted rulers who were friendly, cooperative, and willing to align with its interests. When Sultan Hamad bin Thuwaini rose to power in 1893, Britain found a reliable ally. Hamad was seen as moderate and compliant, a man willing to maintain strong ties with London. British officials supported him, and under his rule, tensions remained relatively quiet. Yet beneath this calm lay the ambitions of other princes, especially Khalid bin Barghash. Khalid was no stranger to politics. He had already once attempted to claim the throne in 1893, following the death of Sultan Ali bin Said. On that occasion, British warships appeared in the harbor, and Khalid quickly backed down. But the dream of ruling Zanzibar never left him. When Sultan Hamad died suddenly on the 25th of August, 1896, Khalid saw his chance. The British, however, had a different candidate in mind, Hamud bin Muhammad, a cousin of the late Sultan who was considered more cooperative. The death of Hamad created a race between Khalid and the British-backed choice. Whoever claimed the throne first would test the balance of power on the island. This was the background to the drama that would soon unfold. Zanzibar was not simply a small island making its own decisions. It was a stage upon which global empires acted out their ambitions. Britain wanted stability and control. Germany had already stepped back after securing its share of the mainland, but it watched with interest. The people of Zanzibar, meanwhile, were left to live with uncertainty, caught between their traditions and the realities of foreign influence. The palace by the sea, where the throne awaited, became the center of this struggle. To the people walking in the markets that week, life went on as usual, bargaining over fish, weaving mats, playing instruments in the streets. But behind the carved doors of the palace, plans were being made. Khalid and his supporters whispered strategies late into the night. The British consul, Basil Cave, sent urgent messages to London and to the commanders of the warships anchored offshore. The background to the war, then, was not only about one man's ambition, but also about a shifting world. It was about the collision of local tradition and global empire, about the end of one era and the beginning of another. The island's history of trade and slavery, its place in the empire's maps, and the ambitions of foreign powers all combined into a single moment of crisis. By late August, the stage was set. A throne had been claimed without permission. Warships had turned their guns toward the palace. Soldiers gathered at the gates, and the people of Stone Town, hearing whispers of conflict, watched and waited. The war, that would last only 38 minutes, was almost ready to begin, but its causes had been centuries in the making. The death of Sultan Hamad bin Thuwaini in late August of 1896 set Zanzibar on a path of crisis. His passing was sudden, and with it came a vacuum of power. For the British, who had carefully supported his rule, it was a troubling moment. For Khalid bin Barghash, it was an opportunity too great to ignore. Within hours of Hamad's death, the struggle for succession erupted, and the calm streets of Stone Town began to buzz with tension. On the morning of the 25th of August, the palace gates opened, and Khalid moved swiftly inside. He was determined, almost defiant in his decision to proclaim himself Sultan. No consultation with the British consul, no careful waiting for approval, just a bold act of self-appointment. From the palace balcony, his flag was raised high, a symbol for all to see that he now considered himself the rightful ruler of Zanzibar. This act electrified the city. Supporters of Khalid cheered in the narrow streets while others whispered in uncertainty. Some merchants welcomed the boldness, believing Khalid would bring independence from foreign control. Others worried about the consequences of defying Britain, whose warships cast long shadows over the harbor. Inside the British consulate, Consul Basil Cave received the news with alarm. He had been informed that Khalid intended to seize the throne, but the speed of events surprised even him. Cave immediately sent messages to the senior naval officers stationed nearby. The British fleet included the HMS St. George, the flagship of Rear Admiral Harry Rawson, as well as several smaller vessels, HMS Raccoon, HMS Thrush, and HMS Sparrow. Their presence was not unusual, for Britain often kept ships near strategic colonies, but now their role would shift from guardians of trade to instruments of diplomacy, and perhaps war. Consul Cave sent a firm message to Khalid. His self-declared sultanate would not be recognized unless Britain approved it. Khalid, however, ignored the warning. Instead, he gathered his loyal followers inside the palace, determined to defend his position. Soldiers armed with rifles lined the courtyard. Cannons, old but still functional, were moved to face the harbor. Around the palace walls, nearly 3,000 men pledged their support to Khalid, though many were lightly trained and ill-prepared for a modern confrontation. The streets of Stone Town began to reflect the tension. Crowds gathered near the palace square, straining to see what would happen next. Children were pulled indoors by anxious parents, while shopkeepers debated whether to close their stalls. Some stayed open, clinging to routine, while others shuttered their doors, sensing that change was coming. Fishermen who usually sang while mending their nets worked in silence, their eyes fixed on the British ships that now seemed to inch closer to shore. On the evening of the 26th of August, Admiral Rawson sent Khalid a final ultimatum. Step down by 9 o'clock the following morning, or Britain would act. The message was clear, firm, and uncompromising. Khalid, however, believed he could withstand the pressure. He had men, he had weapons, and most importantly, he had the palace itself, a strong stone fortress overlooking the harbor. To him, this was not simply about power, but about honor. To surrender without a fight would mean admitting that Zanzibar no longer controlled its own destiny. That night, lanterns burned brightly in the palace windows. Khalid held discussions with his advisors, weighing the risks and rewards. Some urged caution, reminding him of Britain's immense power. Others encouraged defiance, pointing to the soldiers who had pledged loyalty. As the hours passed, the decision became less about strategy and more about pride. Meanwhile, aboard the British ships, preparations were underway. Gun crews checked their cannons, officers studied maps of Stone Town, and sailors whispered about what might happen when the sun rose. For many of them, Zanzibar was a beautiful, almost dreamlike place, with its turquoise waters and fragrant spice markets. Yet by dawn, it might become the site of battle. In the early hours of the 27th of August, the people of Stone Town awoke to an uneasy silence. The usual bustle of the morning market felt subdued, as though the city itself held its breath. At the harbor, British warships floated in a neat line, their flags fluttering in the light breeze. On shore, the palace loomed, its cannons poking from the walls like watchful eyes. Between the two, the tension stretched like a rope pulled too tight. By 8 o'clock, the tension reached its peak. Crowds gathered again in the square, whispering about the ultimatum. Rumors spread quickly. Some claimed Khalid would surrender. Others said the British would leave. Yet when the palace flag still flew proudly, it became clear that Khalid had made his choice. At 8:30, British officers gave their crews final instructions. Ammunition was loaded. Cannons were aimed. The men stood ready, silent, waiting for the order. Inside the palace, Khalid's soldiers also prepared. Rifles were positioned at windows. Guards stood by the gates. Though many of them were untrained, they carried themselves with determination, as though courage alone could match the firepower of a modern navy. As the clock approached 9, the ultimatum's deadline, all of Zanzibar seemed to wait on a single moment. The sun rose higher, casting golden light across the harbor, making the British ships gleam like steel against the blue sea. In the city, people hid behind walls or peered from windows, unsure of whether to stay or flee. Even the animals seemed to sense the tension. The donkeys in the alleys brayed nervously, and the seagulls circled restlessly above the harbor. Then, as the clock struck 9, the silence broke. The war was about to begin. Behind every event in history stand people, leaders, advisors, soldiers, and citizens, each with their own hopes and fears. The Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896, though astonishingly brief, was no exception. To understand why the conflict unfolded as it did, we must look closely at the main figures whose choices shaped its course. Khalid bin Barghash, the self-declared Sultan, Basil Cave, the British consul, and Rear Admiral Harry Rawson, the commander of the British fleet. Khalid bin Barghash was no stranger to the palace walls of Zanzibar. Born into the royal family, he had grown up surrounded by the grandeur of sultans and the whispers of politics. From a young age, he carried a reputation for being ambitious, sometimes restless, and always conscious of the throne that stood at the heart of his world. By the time Sultan Hamad bin Thuwaini passed away, Khalid had already seen one opportunity slip through his fingers. 3 years earlier, when Sultan Ali bin Said died, Khalid had attempted to seize power but was pressured into stepping aside under British threat. That memory, still sharp, made him determined not to retreat again. For Khalid, declaring himself Sultan in 1896 was more than a political act. It was about dignity, pride, and the belief that Zanzibar should decide its own ruler without interference from foreign powers. To him, Britain's insistence on choosing a compliant leader was an insult, a reminder that the island's independence was fading. By raising his flag over the palace, Khalid was not only claiming a throne, he was making a statement to his people and to the world. Yet ambition carries weight. In the quiet hours of the night, as lanterns flickered in the palace corridors, Khalid must have felt the burden of his choice. He knew the British had warships, cannons, and discipline. He knew that his own men, though loyal, were poorly trained compared to seasoned sailors. Still, he pressed forward, guided by conviction and perhaps by the hope that Britain would hesitate to strike. If Khalid represented defiance, Basil Cave represented caution. As the British consul in Zanzibar, Cave was the empire's eyes and ears on the island. His role demanded diplomacy, observation, and the ability to act quickly when circumstances shifted. When news of Sultan Hamad's death reached him, Cave understood immediately that succession would be dangerous. He had seen Khalid's ambitions before and knew that Britain's interests required a leader who could be trusted to follow advice. To Cave, Khalid's boldness was not just a personal ambition but a direct challenge to British influence in East Africa. Yet Cave was not reckless. He sent letters, delivered warnings, and attempted to persuade Khalid to step down peacefully. His communications were clear but firm, always maintaining the tone of a diplomat rather than a soldier. Cave knew the responsibility of his position. Any misstep could ignite a conflict that would echo beyond Zanzibar's shores. Still, as Khalid ignored each warning, Cave grew more convinced that words would not be enough. The consul's reports to London became sharper, and his coordination with the naval officers became more urgent. For Cave, the matter was simple. Either Khalid stepped aside, or Britain would enforce its authority. If Khalid embodied ambition and Cave embodied diplomacy, then Rear Admiral Harry Rawson embodied decisive action. A career officer in the Royal Navy, Rawson was known for his discipline, precision, and unwavering loyalty to duty. Stationed in the region as commander of the British fleet, Rawson received Cave's reports with seriousness. His task was not to debate politics but to enforce Britain's position if necessary. His fleet, anchored in the harbor, symbolized imperial strength. HMS St. George, HMS Raccoon, HMS Thrush, and HMS Sparrow, each bristling with guns that far outmatched the palace's defenses. Rawson's role in the crisis was to prepare for the worst while hoping for resolution. He issued orders, arranged crews, and ensured that his ships were ready. Yet, like Cave, he did not act recklessly. Ultimatums were delivered, deadlines were set, and Khalid was given every opportunity to step down peacefully. Only when the clock ran out would Rawson unleash his fleet. Behind his calm, disciplined demeanor, however, lay a sense of responsibility. He knew that firing on the palace would endanger lives, not just soldiers but also civilians in the crowded streets of Stone Town. He also knew that if Britain hesitated, its credibility as a colonial power would weaken. For Rawson, the challenge was not only military but symbolic, to demonstrate that Britain's word carried weight across the empire. Though Khalid, Cave, and Rawson stood at the center, other figures also played important roles. Hamud bin Mohammed, the man favored by the British, waited quietly in the background, prepared to step into power once Khalid was removed. To him, patience was a strategy, and loyalty to Britain a path to the throne. Among Khalid's supporters were palace guards, soldiers, and loyal family members. Many of them had little experience in battle, yet they stood by their leader, driven by tradition, loyalty, or simply the need to protect their livelihoods. Their courage was real, even if their weapons were outdated. And then there were the ordinary people of Zanzibar, the shopkeepers, fishermen, and children who found themselves watching history unfold in their own streets. They were not decision-makers, yet their lives would be shaped by the choices made in the palace and on the warships. Their voices rarely appear in official reports, yet they carried the weight of uncertainty, waiting to see what dawn would bring. The conflict was not only about politics but also about human emotion. Khalid acted out of pride and ambition, unwilling to let history repeat his earlier failure. Cave acted out of duty and caution, determined to prevent instability. Rawson acted out of responsibility, balancing the need for discipline with the weight of imperial authority. Each man believed his path was justified. Khalid saw himself as the defender of Zanzibar's sovereignty. Cave saw himself as the protector of British influence. Rawson saw himself as the executor of imperial will. Their motives collided, and the collision would soon echo through cannon fire. As the night of August 26th gave way to the morning of August 27th, the roles of these men were set. Khalid would remain defiant in the palace. Cave would hold his diplomatic ground. Rawson would prepare his fleet. The curtain of history was rising, and each actor knew his part. When the sun rose on the morning of August 27, 1896, few could have predicted how swiftly history would turn. By 9 o'clock, the ultimatum given to Khalid bin Barghash had expired. By 9:38, the war was over. In less than the time it takes to walk from one end of Stone Town to the other, the balance of power on Zanzibar shifted forever. The palace, once a proud symbol of independence and ambition, now stood damaged. Its walls bore the marks of British firepower, and its defenders, those who had stood with Khalid in defiance, were scattered or captured. The self-declared Sultan had fled, slipping away from the palace before the final shells struck. His departure marked not only the end of his claim, but also the end of any real challenge to British authority on the island. In the hours following the bombardment, Stonetown was filled with a strange mix of relief and unease. The thunder of cannons gave way to silence, broken only by the cries of civilians emerging from hiding. Some people stepped cautiously from their homes, clutching their children, scanning the streets for danger. Others hurried to the harbor, staring at the British ships that now looked even more imposing against the calm sea. The British moved quickly to restore order. Soldiers and sailors secured the palace grounds, ensuring no further resistance would emerge. Within a day, Hamud bin Mohammed, the British-backed candidate, was installed as the new sultan. His coronation was swift and symbolic, demonstrating to all that Zanzibar's throne would no longer be decided solely by local tradition, but by imperial approval. Khalid, meanwhile, found temporary refuge within the German consulate. Protected by international law, he avoided immediate capture, though his escape did little to restore his ambitions. Eventually, he fled the island altogether, living in exile while Britain strengthened its hold over Zanzibar. The war's brevity did not make it insignificant. On the contrary, its short duration highlighted the overwhelming power of the British Empire at the height of its influence. The message was clear: defiance, no matter how bold, would be met with swift and decisive action. For Zanzibar, the war marked the end of any serious resistance to British control. Though the Sultanate continued to exist in name, its sovereignty was deeply compromised. British advisors took stronger roles in governance, and the island became little more than a protectorate. Independence of decision, once fiercely guarded, had slipped away in just over half an hour. For Britain, the event reinforced its image as an empire of unmatched strength. Newspapers in London reported the victory with a mix of pride and astonishment, calling it the shortest war in history. To the imperial mindset, it was a demonstration of efficiency, order restored in minutes, authority unchallenged. Yet beneath the headlines, some observers recognized the fragility of such dominance. Could an empire built on such overwhelming power also sow seeds of resentment? For the people of Zanzibar, the impact was both immediate and long-lasting. In the short term, many faced loss: homes damaged, livelihoods disrupted, families displaced. The palace grounds, once a place of grandeur, became a reminder of destruction. Markets reopened, but with caution. Fishermen returned to the sea, but their songs carried a quieter tone. Children played in the streets again, but some whispered about the thunder they had heard that morning. In the long term, the war deepened the sense of colonial presence. The new Sultan, Hamud bin Mohammed, introduced reforms under British guidance. Some of these changes were welcomed, such as further steps to end the remnants of the slave trade, which Britain had long sought to abolish. Yet others were seen as signs of foreign control, stripping Zanzibar of its independent identity. The people adapted, as they always had. Traders continued to sell spices, women still carried baskets of fruit through the alleys, and sailors still raised the triangular sails of their dhows. But beneath the daily rhythms lay a quiet recognition. The island was no longer its own master. Beyond Zanzibar, the war sent ripples across the imperial world. Other colonies watched closely, noting Britain's willingness to act quickly and decisively. For European powers engaged in the scramble for Africa, it was a reminder that even small territories could ignite international attention. In Germany, Khalid's refuge at their consulate caused a brief diplomatic stir, though it never escalated into open conflict. The incident revealed how fragile international relations could be, where even a minor war lasting less than an hour could touch on broader rivalries. For historians and observers, the event became a symbol of the strange contrasts of empire. Here was a war so brief it could be timed on a clock, yet its consequences lasted for decades. Here was a palace defended with courage, yet undone by overwhelming firepower. Here was an island that had thrived on trade and culture, now bound to the ambitions of faraway capitals. Though the war was short, its memory lingered. For those who lived through it, The sound of cannon fire echoing across the harbor was not easily forgotten. Some remembered the fear, hiding with their families as the sky filled with smoke. Others remembered the shock of how quickly it all ended, as though history itself had sprinted past them in a single morning. And for Khalid bin Barghash, the emotional weight must have been immense. He had seized the throne with boldness, only to lose it in less than an hour. His name would forever be tied to that brief moment of defiance. For some, he was a symbol of pride, a man who dared to resist empire. For others, he was reckless, leading his supporters into a hopeless confrontation. The war that lasted 38 minutes teaches us that the length of a conflict does not determine its significance. A war of 30 years and a war of 38 minutes can both reshape nations and alter the course of history. What matters are the choices, the consequences, and the lessons carried forward. For Zanzibar, the lesson was about the limits of resistance in an age dominated by empires. For Britain, the lesson was about the necessity of maintaining authority in its colonies, no matter the scale. For the world, the lesson was about the strange ways history unfolds, sometimes slowly, over centuries, and sometimes in the blink of an eye. In the wake of the war, life on Zanzibar resumed. The markets reopened, the harbor filled with sails, and the scent of spices once again drifted through the streets. But the island had changed. Its independence had been reduced to a shadow, and its story had been marked forever by a war that lasted less than a single morning. On the morning of Thursday, August the 27th, 1896, the air over Zanzibar carried the heavy stillness that often precedes a storm. The alleys of Stone Town were quieter than usual. Shopkeepers opened their doors with hesitation, fishermen watched the sea with unease, and mothers kept their children indoors. Rumors had already spread. The British ultimatum to Khalid bin Barghash was set to expire at 9:00 sharp. From the harbor, the sight was imposing. 5 British warships sat anchored with their black smokestacks rising like pillars. Their decks were alive with movement as sailors stood ready at their posts. Cannons, polished and angled, pointed toward the palace complex on shore. Inside the palace, Khalid paced. Dressed in ceremonial robes yet restless, he ignored the whispers of advisers urging caution. Around him stood a small force of loyal defenders, perhaps 700 men at most, armed with rifles, a handful of artillery pieces, and sheer determination. They had barricaded doors, prepared sandbags, and positioned themselves at windows overlooking the harbor. At exactly 9:00, silence fell. The ultimatum had ended. The British commander, Rear Admiral Harry Rawson, gave the order. If the Sultan did not surrender, the ships would fire. At 9:02, the first cannon roared. The sound split the air, rolling across the harbor and echoing through the narrow streets. A plume of smoke leapt skyward, followed by the thunderous crash as the shells struck the palace wall. The war had begun. Civilians hiding nearby covered their ears. Children clung to their mothers, and the dhows in the harbor rocked violently as waves rippled outward. By 9:10, the palace was shrouded in smoke. Shells crashed against its coral stone walls, sending fragments tumbling into the courtyard. Defenders returned fire with rifles and a few artillery shots, but their weapons were no match for the warships. The sea answered with precision, each broadside shaking the earth beneath the city. Khalid, still within the palace grounds, tried to maintain control, shouting orders and urging his men to hold. Yet already parts of the roof had begun to collapse. At 9:20, the palace was burning. Flames licked at wooden beams, and smoke rose like a dark banner into the sky. The defenders, though brave, were overwhelmed. Some continued to fire through the windows, but their resistance was increasingly symbolic. The harbor, too, was alive with chaos. One royal yacht, moored close to the palace, attempted to return fire with a small cannon. Within minutes, it was sunk. The mast tilted, the hull slipped beneath the waves, and sailors swam desperately toward the shore. By 9:30, the outcome was certain. The palace was collapsing in places, its ornate balconies reduced to rubble. The sound of cannon fire continued. but now it was accompanied by the cries of those fleeing through the streets. Yet even amid the destruction, the defenders' courage was noted. Rifle shots still rang out, though faint against the overwhelming bombardment. Inside, Khalid realized the inevitability of defeat. With trusted allies, he slipped through a side exit and made his way toward the German consulate, abandoning the palace before its final walls gave way. His departure marked the turning point. The Sultan who had defied Britain was now gone. At 9:38, the guns fell silent. Just as quickly as it had begun, the war was over. The bombardment ceased, the air cleared, and an eerie quiet spread across Stone Town. In less than 40 minutes, the fate of the island had been decided. Smoke drifted above the ruins of the palace, curling into the morning sky. Civilians began to emerge from hiding, cautiously stepping into streets littered with debris. The once grand palace, the symbol of defiance, was now a blackened shell. The British ships remained in the harbor, their decks steady and their flags unshaken. On shore, soldiers moved to secure the palace grounds. Already, word was spreading. Khalid had fled, Hamud bin Muhammad would soon be installed, and the Sultanate's independence was no more. For those who had witnessed the events, the memory would remain vivid. The sound of thunder at sea, the sight of flames consuming royal walls, and the astonishing speed with which history had shifted, all compressed into 38 minutes that would never be forgotten. When the last echoes of cannon fire faded over Stone Town, a strange quiet descended upon the island. The bombardment had lasted barely more than half an hour, yet its impact felt immense. The palace, once a towering symbol of royal pride, now stood as a blackened ruin, smoke still curling from its walls. The city's residents emerged from hiding, cautious and shaken, as if stepping into a world that had changed overnight. While the palace crumbled, Khalid bin Barghash slipped away under cover of the chaos. Accompanied by a small group of loyal guards, he darted through side alleys and hidden paths, his ceremonial robes hastily exchanged for simpler garments. His destination was the German consulate, a place where he believed he would be safe from British reach. The German consulate, a stately building with its own flag fluttering, granted him asylum. Though Britain demanded his surrender, international laws of diplomacy complicated the matter. For days, Khalid remained under German protection, hidden behind guarded walls. Eventually, he was smuggled out of Zanzibar aboard a German vessel, taken first to Dar es Salaam and later deeper into German East Africa. Though he escaped immediate capture, his reign had ended almost as swiftly as it began. With Khalid gone, the British wasted no time in restoring order. Within hours of the bombardment, their choice for ruler, Hamud bin Muhammad, was declared the new sultan. Unlike Khalid, Hamud was seen as cooperative, willing to work alongside Britain rather than against it. His ascension marked the end of the brief crisis and the beginning of a new chapter for Zanzibar. On the streets of Stone Town, British Marines and sailors patrolled to ensure calm. The city's residents, though unsettled, quickly returned to daily life. Merchants reopened their shops, fishermen went back to sea, and the call to prayer echoed once more from the mosques. Yet, beneath the surface, many knew that something fundamental had shifted. Zanzibar's independence had effectively dissolved. The palace, once the pride of the sultans, lay in ruins. Charred beams jutted upward like broken ribs, and piles of coral stone filled the courtyard. British officers ordered the site cleared, not only to prevent danger but also to send a message. Defiance would not be tolerated. Still, amid the rubble, children played, collecting fragments of wood and stone as though they were souvenirs of history. The people of Stone Town adjusted with remarkable resilience, blending sorrow with pragmatism. Though Khalid no longer ruled Zanzibar, his name lived on in whispers and debates. Some remembered him as bold, even heroic, for standing up to a great empire. Others saw his defiance as reckless, a move that brought destruction upon the island. In German East Africa, he attempted to remain active in politics, but his power was never the same. Years later, he would eventually be captured and exiled further, living out his days far from the palace he once claimed. For the people of Zanzibar, life after the war was both familiar and altered. Daily routines returned, yet the sense of sovereignty had dimmed. The presence of British officials grew stronger, and decisions about the island's future were increasingly shaped not in Stone Town, but in London. Still, the spirit of Zanzibar endured. The markets continued to fill with spices, cinnamon, clove, and nutmeg, whose scents drifted through the air. Dhows still sailed gracefully across the turquoise waters, and in the evenings families gathered beneath the stars, telling stories of sultans past, including the one who dared to defy an empire for 38 minutes. The shortest war in history did not drag on with prolonged suffering. Instead, it struck like lightning, sudden, fierce, and unforgettable. Though the battle itself had ended quickly, the memory lingered, etched into the collective mind of Zanzibar and recorded in the annals of world history. By the time the sun set on that fateful day, Stone Town was quieter. Smoke no longer rose from the palace. The harbor calmed, and the people, though shaken, resumed life with remarkable strength. The war was over, but its lesson, that empires could decide the fate of nations in moments, remained clear. The Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896 has often been remembered as a curiosity of history, the shortest war ever fought. Yet behind the brevity lies a story rich with meaning, a tale of ambition, empire, defiance, and the swift passage of power. For Zanzibar, the war revealed how fragile independence could be in an age of empires. A proud sultanate that had once commanded influence across the Indian Ocean now found itself unable to withstand the might of a global power. Sultan Khalid bin Barghash's bold stand lasted barely more than half an hour, yet it symbolized the struggle of smaller nations to preserve identity in a world increasingly shaped by colonial ambition. For Britain, the war was more than a local dispute. It was a demonstration of authority. By responding swiftly and decisively, Britain sent a message not only to Zanzibar but to all territories under its watch. Resistance would not be tolerated. The war may have lasted 38 minutes, but its echoes reached far beyond the shores of East Africa. Amid these political lessons, there were also human stories. Families who hid in their homes during the bombardment, soldiers who defended a palace with little more than courage, children who later played among the ruins, carrying fragments of coral stone as reminders of a day when the world seemed to tremble. For them, the war was not an abstract piece of history, but a lived experience, frightening, confusing, and unforgettable. Khalid bin Barghash's defiance showed the strength of pride and the desire for self-determination. Yet his defeat revealed the overwhelming imbalance of power in the colonial era. His ambition, though admirable in spirit, collided with the reality of industrial weaponry and imperial politics. From this, a lesson emerges. Courage alone does not always bring victory. Sometimes it serves instead as a symbol, reminding future generations of the will to resist even when success seems impossible. Many wars stretch over years, even decades, leaving long trails of suffering. This war, compressed into 38 minutes, stands apart. Its brevity makes it memorable, yet its impact should not be underestimated. It altered the course of Zanzibar's history, marked the end of meaningful independence, and reinforced Britain's dominance in the region. Today, more than a century later, the story of the shortest war in history continues to be told. Tourists in Zanzibar still walk past the remnants of the old palace site. Historians revisit the event, fascinated by its speed and significance. And storytellers share it as both a remarkable curiosity and a cautionary tale. The memory endures because it blends the extraordinary with the universal. The extraordinary in how swiftly it unfolded, the universal in its themes of pride, resistance, and the clash between the weak and the powerful. The war that lasted 38 minutes may have ended quickly, but it carries a timeless reminder. that history is not only measured in length, but in meaning. Even the briefest of conflicts can leave lessons that stretch across centuries. As the people of Zanzibar rebuilt their lives after that fateful morning, they did so with resilience, proving that while empires may dictate politics, the spirit of a people cannot be so easily conquered. And so, the shortest war in history stands not only as a record of time, but as a reflection on the enduring strength of human dignity. And so, the war that shook Zanzibar was over in just 38 minutes. A palace in ruins, a sultan in exile, and a nation forever changed. Though brief, this war left behind lessons that echo through history, that power can shift in moments, that pride and defiance come with a cost, and that even the shortest events can shape the destiny of nations. The Anglo-Zanzibar War reminds us that history is not always measured in years or decades. Sometimes it is written in a single morning, in the silence that follows the thunder of cannons, and in the resilience of people who rebuild after the storm. If you enjoyed this journey into the shortest war in history, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Tell us in the comments, what other hidden moments of history would you like us to uncover next? Because every corner of the past holds a story worth remembering.